Welcome to a Peskotomuhkati Podcast. This edition is a conversation with lead negotiator Paul Williams. We began by speaking about how language affects relationships and treaties. You know, Paul, when I was listening to you speak a little while ago, and you said something really interesting, that there were tenses in, we're talking about language, tenses in Indigenous languages that are far beyond what English can express, or maybe even Latin, since you're a lawyer. Tell me more about that. That's fascinating.
Okay, let me tell you something about the languages that affects the treaties. If we were speaking English or French, if we were speaking Spanish or French, I would have to decide if you were a usted, or a vous, or a tu. And if I was calling you tu, a friendship term, before you were ready, you would push back. English doesn't have that. English has done away with relationships. And most Indigenous languages in this part of the world talk about a variety of relationships rather than just you and thee, but in fact, make you think about, how am I related to this person? Or how am I related to that thing? Where do I stand in relationship to it? It means that when we have a relationship between nations that is family-based, I have to think about, what am I calling you? What does it mean in terms of how I am to behave with you? How are we to behave together? So language doesn't dictate behavior, but it influences it.
And it is culture.
And
deeply.
It's deeply affected by and affecting culture. So, for example, today I had a conversation with the Registrar of Indian Affairs about custom adoption. And the federal policy at this point is that a custom adoption must be to the exclusion of the biological parents. That doesn't work in a community where a kid calls every woman of his extended family ista, mom, and where there's a huge amount of co-mothering going on. So we're talking not just about different laws, but different cultures behind the laws that make the laws the way they are. And the challenge is to get people to accept the idea that the treaty relationship is a family relationship, leads to an expectation. In a family, we help each other. In a family, nobody says, I'm going to stick to what I promised you on December 3rd, 2015. It says, I'm going to stick to what our relationship is.
I'll always be your mother. I'll always be your father.
I may not want to recognize you all the time, but I don't have much choice, yes.
How did you, as a negotiator, introduce these concepts of language that speak so deeply to the Indigenous cultures? How did you introduce that at the negotiating table, or before, or when did that come up?
It's gradual. It's deliberate. We're not hiding it. Really, in Peskotomuhkati country, we began on September 30th, 2016. There I am, naming a precise date after I said I wouldn't. But that's the day we reaffirmed, it's pretty close to the 250th anniversary of the making of a covenant chain relationship. And it was the Deputy Superintendent General of Indian Affairs for the British Empire who probably delivered a wampum belt on that date, creating a family-like, extending a family-like relationship, including Canada was asking, what's your dispute resolution process? And we said, we don't have one. We have a concern resolution process so that we don't allow things to become disputes. But in 2016, we reaffirmed the treaty relationship. We gave the Government of Canada a new wampum belt with the year 2016 on it, because the last one had 1766 on it. So this one is bead for bead the same. gave it to the federal negotiator and said, you are now the keeper of this belt. You bring it to every negotiation. You hand it over to our negotiator and we will open the negotiations. So we're developing the same procedural traditions, or we're restoring them in a way that's meaningful. And every time we open a negotiation, we begin by giving thanks together. And that is giving thanks to and acknowledging each part of the natural world together, and expressing the hope that we, as part of this circle of life, will be able to maintain and fulfill our responsibilities. Part of that is saying we're all human beings together. We all agree on the big stuff. Now we can get to the smaller things that we have to work out because we've neglected them, because we have to repolish them, because we have work to do together. But the big stuff, that we're human beings in this place together and we have a responsibility to look after it and look after each other and look after our coming generations. Really hard for anybody to take issue with those.
Exactly.
So we do the big stuff first and do the easy things first, and then we move to the more detailed. We do principles before we do details. We do big before we do little. It's taken a while to establish the trust, and also to establish the comfort of, yes, there's a way of doing this.
Now, in my lifetime, and I don't know much about negotiating treaties or whatever, but I do know that formerly it took a long time. And you said you started just a few years ago?
I've never worked on anything that's taken less than 20 years. No, that's one of the traditions that we deal with, is that things take as long as they take to do well, that we shouldn't rush. At the same time, we are deeply conscious of the fact that we've got a lot of elders who've been denied rights.
All their lives.
All their lives, and they need the enhanced health care more than ever. We've got a lot of young people who need the help with education now, not 10 years from now. So we're really talking about interim agreements as well as long-term ones. But how long is this taking? The present council was formed in 1998. We're coming on 21 years. Who waits 21 years? Not too many people in Canada.
And it's go, rush here.
No.
Not at your table.
No, and so there's this mix of, we will take the time to do it right, and we will not be artificially delayed. And if we find we are being improperly delayed, there are other options. There always are.
I read a couple of days ago that when you look at across Canada, Indigenously owned lands, they are actually doing better in terms of the species that live on those lands. We're not hearing drastic stories about, fish dying off or birds disappearing.
I live in the Six Nations Grand River Territory in southern Ontario. It's one of 3 viable patches remaining of Carolinian forest in Canada. The other 2 are the Chippewa-Munsee Oneida Reserve and Walpole Island. That is, Indigenous lands are the last viable Carolinian lands in Canada. Why? Partly because, ironically, the people couldn't mortgage the land, couldn't get farm equipment, and their agriculture was driven out of existence in the 1920s. But partly because the people look after the land and tend not to see land as a commodity, tend to, and this is something I run into. I deal with a lot of hunting situations, and hunting involves a relationship, maintaining a relationship So in Peskotomuhkati country, we say the treaty right to fish, including a right to fish commercially, is inseparable from the right that there should be fish in the future, which is therefore inseparable with the right to participate meaningfully in managing fish stocks to guarantee that future generations will have fish, which in turn is inseparable from the right to manage not just the fish stock, but the entire ecosystem in which the fish live. So there's a convergence between a sense of obligation and the right to implement that sense of obligation. I think you'll find that Indigenous nations who haven't bought fully into a commercial economy are very much more conscientious about how do we look after this place. And part of it is, frankly, people who've been here 10,000 years aren't in the same hurry to develop things as people who've been here a couple of generations.
And the globe could learn a lot from that treatment of land, air, water. In 1977, the Haudenosaunee sent their first delegation to the United Nations at Geneva with a book called A Basic Call to Consciousness, which really said, we're facing an environmental crisis, wake up. And that's 42 years ago. And only now is there any sense of urgency in most developed nations. And I hope there's a sense of urgency, because it doesn't sound good.
No. It's scary. And I forget who said the world is a cruel place to small peoples. But small peoples, Indigenous peoples who are close to the land, are more deeply affected, more quickly affected by environmental crises than other people. And the question is, how can they use, for example, in Canada, treaty rights to engage proper environmental protection? What kind of leverage do we have? And that's a whole interesting field of Canadian law that hasn't been fully explored yet.
It's your next challenge.
Yeah, I live at the edge.
Thank you so much, Paul Williams.
You're welcome.
You've been listening to a Peskotomuhkati podcast. Any views expressed in these podcasts are not necessarily those of the nation, council, employees, citizens, neighbors, or friends. Our objective is stimulating conversation. Thanks for listening. There are many ways to join in the conversation or find out more. The YouTube channel is Peskotomuhkati at Skutik. You can visit the office or write to 27 King Street, St. Stephen, New Brunswick, E3L 2C1. The main office phone number is area code 506-466-2221. The fax is 506-466-2217. Visit the website konaskamkuk.com. Facebook is Passamaquoddy at Skutik Office. Instagram at Passamaquoddy Office. And Twitter at Skutikat.